And yet it's controversial, not to me, but it's controversial apparently, if a candidate even suggests that big chunks of these lands should be given back to the states.
Yes, it's regarded as controversial because, again, they like the consolidation of power. They want all government, they want more things generally to be government decisions, and they want virtually all government decisions to be federal. Now, this shouldn't be the case because there's actually a lot of evidence suggesting that the states can manage public land in a more environmentally sensible fashion, in a manner that protects the various interests at stake.
And there's a lot of evidence the feds can't.
And a lot of evidence that the feds can't because they don't, because they manage it very badly. And nonetheless, progressives tend to want to consolidate everything, including land management in the federal government.
Now, you have an individual in your book who viewers of this program have some general familiarity with, George Mason. Why did you include him in your book?
George Mason was a very unconventional founding father. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He was a reluctant one. He was a businessman first and foremost. He wanted to be home with his family, and he wanted to be running his business. He didn't want to be there in Philadelphia, and he didn't want to be getting involved in politics. But he did it because he loved his country, and he expressed grave reservations with the Constitution, ultimately voting against it because of the fact that he didn't think it did enough to protect liberty. This is a man whose legacy lives on, definitely in Virginia, but many Americans are not as familiar with him, and that's why I tell his story in this book.
And tell us a little bit about his story. He opposed slavery, but he owned some slaves. He was an influential voice at the Constitutional Convention. And he was friends with Washington, lived near Washington, but he opposed the Constitution, and so Washington was furious with him.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that was quite a Virginia convention, wasn't it? You had Patrick Henry standing up against it. And they had quite a convention in Massachusetts, right? I mean, the ratification almost didn't make it in Massachusetts and Virginia.
That's exactly.
And New York, as a matter of fact.
That's exactly right. You mentioned slavery and George Mason's approach to that, and it's counterintuitive for many people when they learn that you had George Mason, a slaveholder, who spoke out against slavery, calling it a scourge of sorts, something that would bring the judgment of God upon this country, and something that was wrong and would lead to all kinds of problems, and was itself immoral and repugnant to the conscience. He was joined in this by Luther Martin, who is also in the book. Luther Martin and George Mason were both slaveholders, and they both opposed slavery and did so openly at the convention and in the ratifying process. They did so in a way that I think most people would find surprising, because most people would think, okay, slaveholders would automatically be opposed to anything that brought the subject up. But Luther Martin and George Mason were not afraid to do this. In fact, they understood that it was absolutely necessary, even though it made things awkward there. They understood that this was something that had been put into place many centuries before they came along, and would end up being a problem if the new republic got off on the wrong foot, which it would do by perpetuating slavery.
And so how do you answer particularly leftists who say, well, they were hypocrites. You know, it's one thing to be opposed to slavery, it's another thing to own slaves. They were kind of stuck, weren't they, from an economic perspective, where they inherited slaves in the family. I'm not defending, I'm not making excuses, but, you know, Lincoln addressed this, right?
Yes.
In 1858 in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. And he would always point to the Declaration of Independence. And he would always say, these men did what they could do, and then they left it to their progeny to resolve the rest of it. He says, read the Declaration of Independence. It says nothing about race, unalienable rights, all human beings, every individual. And he praised them over and over and over again. And there he is, the president during the Civil War, trying to explain that those principles and values that are eternal, that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence, right? Mason and the others embraced and promoted.
That all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
Right.
These were things that echoed down through the generations, and they firmly believed them. There were, among the founding generation, those who understood that this was wrong, and they actually did try. That's why I push back against those who describe men like George Mason and Luther Martin as hypocrites. They were trying to end it against their own interests, against the economic interests of their families, of their businesses, and of those immediately surrounding them. They tried to stop it, and they understood that it would create problems, and we should revere them for that. This, by the way, ties into what we talk about in another chapter of this book when I tell the story of Mum Bet.
You have Mum Bet, another person I never heard of before. Who's Mum Bet?
Mum Bet was a slave. She was a slave in the household of Colonel John Ashley, a Massachusetts state judge. Colonel Ashley was involved in some early discussions, what became known as the Sheffield Declaration, which in turn was worked in a slightly different form to the Massachusetts State Constitution of 1780. And in that declaration, it acknowledged that all human beings are free and equal in a state of nature and in the eyes of God. Mum Bet was there in the Ashley residence as a slave when those words were originally written. When they became part of the Massachusetts State Constitution, which John Adams wrote, she thought about it, and she thought, if in fact all human beings are free and equal in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law now, then I should be free. Mm-hmm. And so she went to a man named Sedgwick, who had also been present in the Ashley home for the drafting of the Sheffield Declaration, and retained him as her lawyer. And he took this case all the way up to the highest court in the state of Massachusetts. She won her freedom. She did so under state law. Now, this is one of my big pushbacks to any who would argue that state law, giving states authority, autonomy to regulate their own internal affairs, is somehow hostile to the rights of human beings, hostile to the little guy. Quite the opposite is true. Look at the Massachusetts State Constitution. Mm-hmm. This resulted in the first freeing of slaves in America that we have record of as a legal matter. And Mum Bet seized this moment. Mum Bet was an early American hero, and she was an African-American woman. We owe her a debt of gratitude.